They called him the Silver Polisher. Not to his face, never to his face. But Arthur Penhaligon could hear it in the way his brother-in-law Gerald laughed when he walked past the dining room, where the family sat eating roast chicken while Arthur ate alone in the kitchen. He was 75 years old, a widower for 5 years, living in the drafty attic of what used to be his own home before the Sterlings convinced him to sign it all away. The landscaping business he'd built over 4 decades? Gone. Transferred to Gerald's name with a handshake and a promise to take care of everything. The retirement fund? Drained to pay for Sterling family vacations, his nephew's gambling debts, his niece's 3rd wedding. Now he spent his mornings trimming hedges he used to own and his evenings polishing silver for dinners he wasn't invited to attend. Then came the reading of the will. The Sterling matriarch had died, and the family gathered like vultures, expecting mansions, stocks, and offshore accounts. Instead, the lawyer announced a final asset, a collapsing hunting cabin deep in the Appalachian wilderness. And a challenge. Arthur must live there alone for 6 months to claim the deed. The Sterlings erupted in laughter. Send the old man to die in the woods, they said. He'll be begging to come back within a week. But when Arthur descended through the rotting floorboards of that worthless shack and found the hidden iron ring beneath the dirt, when he entered the code scratched on the back of his late wife's locket, and the steel door hissed open to reveal a climate-controlled vault containing lost botanical patents, extinct plant specimens, and artifacts worth over $100 million, everything changed. The family that had stolen his dignity would never touch a single coin. Before we dive into Arthur's revenge, hit that subscribe button right now. Because when you do, you're choosing to stand with people who refuse to stay down. Drop a comment with your country below, and I promise you, the universe rewards loyalty. Tomorrow's story will prove it. Now let's watch Arthur Penhaligon reclaim everything they try to bury. Arthur's knees cracked as he knelt beside the mahogany sideboard, polishing cloth in hand, working the tarnish from a serving platter that probably cost more than his entire year's allowance. Through the doorway, he could hear Gerald holding court at the dinner table, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who'd never earned anything in his life. The old man's upstairs again, Gerald said, and the siblings laughed. Probably can't even remember which room is his. Arthur's hand paused mid-stroke. He remembered everything. He remembered when this house was his, when these hedges were saplings he'd planted with his own hands, when his wife Eleanor was alive and the Sterlings were just distant relatives who sent Christmas cards. That was before the stroke scare that wasn't really a stroke, before Gerald's concerned visits turned into financial advice, before the papers appeared with the company letterhead already filled in. Just a formality, Arthur. This way the business stays in the family. You'll still run everything. Lies wrapped in smiles. Now he slept in the attic where the heating didn't reach and ate his meals standing at the kitchen counter after the family had finished. He trimmed the roses he used to hybridize, mowed the lawns he used to landscape, and polished the silver he used to own. His sister-in-law Diane walked past without acknowledging him, her perfume expensive and suffocating. His nephew Marcus asked him to fetch more wine from the cellar like he was the help. And he did it, every single time. Because where else would he go? Where else did he have left? Eleanor had been gone 5 years, and with her went the last person who'd called him by his name instead of the old man. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old money, the kind of smell that made Arthur feel like he was trespassing just by breathing. The Sterlings filled the room, perched on the edges of their chairs like predators waiting for the kill. Gerald sat directly across from the lawyer, his expensive suit slightly too tight across the shoulders. Diane examined her manicure. Marcus checked his phone. Eleanor's sister Victoria, the matriarch who just passed, had always been different from the rest of them, quieter, watchful. Arthur had only met her a handful of times, usually at family gatherings where she'd observed the circus with bemused detachment. The lawyer, a severe woman named Patricia Hendricks, adjusted her glasses and began reading. To my nephew Gerald Sterling, I leave my collection of fountain pens, as he's always appreciated the art of signing his name to things that don't belong to him. Gerald's smile faltered. To my niece Diane, I leave my pearl necklace, synthetic of course, to match the sincerity of her concern for family. Diane's face flushed crimson. The room temperature dropped 20 degrees. To my great-nephew Marcus, I leave my collection of self-help books, which he'll never read, because reading requires attention span. Then Patricia looked directly at Arthur. And to Arthur Penhaligon, my late niece's husband, I leave my hunting cabin in the Appalachian Mountains on one condition. He must live there alone for 6 months. If he completes this challenge, the property and all its contents become his permanently. The room erupted. That death trap! Gerald sputtered. The roof's half collapsed. Diane's voice cut through the noise like a knife. He'll never survive 6 months. He can barely climb the stairs. Marcus laughed outright. She's basically killing him. This is elder abuse from beyond the grave. Arthur sat perfectly still, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The cabin. He remembered it vaguely from decades ago, a hunting lodge deep in the woods where Victoria's husband used to disappear for weeks at a time. He'd been there once, maybe twice. It had been rustic even then. "Will you accept the challenge, Mr. Penhaligon?" Patricia asked, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. Every head turned toward him. Gerald's expression was already calculating, probably wondering how long before they could claim the property after Arthur's inevitable failure. Diane looked like she was attending a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Marcus had his phone out, likely Googling mountain survival rates for seniors. Arthur thought about the attic room, the polishing cloth, the hedges that used to be his. The way Gerald said the old man, like he was furniture that had lost its value. He thought about Eleanor, who'd loved him when he still believed he deserved love. And he thought about 6 months of silence, 6 months of nobody, 6 months of cold and isolation that somehow sounded more welcoming than another day in the house that used to be his home. "I accept," he said. The mountain road ended 3 miles before the cabin. Arthur stood at the trailhead with nothing but a military surplus rucksack containing 4 changes of clothes, a first aid kit, his medications, a water filter, and a photograph of Eleanor from their wedding day. The lawyer had provided GPS coordinates and a sat phone for emergencies, along with a stipulation. If he called for rescue, he forfeited the challenge. Gerald had driven him to the trailhead in complete silence, his jaw tight, with barely suppressed irritation. "You're really doing this," he'd said, not a question. "It's not too late to be reasonable, Arthur. Sign the cabin over to the family trust, and we'll set you up in a nice assisted living facility. Meals provided, activities, people your own age." Arthur had shouldered his pack without responding. He'd stopped being reasonable the moment he'd signed away his business. The trail climbed steeply through dense oak and pine, the October air sharp with the promise of early winter. His knees protested every upward step, his breathing came hard and ragged, but he kept moving. For hours later, as the sun began its descent, he saw it. The cabin was worse than he'd imagined. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, shingles missing like teeth from an old mouth. One window was completely gone, covered with a piece of rotting plywood. The porch had collapsed on the left side, the boards gray and splintered. Vines had consumed the chimney. The whole structure leaned slightly to the right, as if it was tired of standing and considering lying down for good. Arthur pushed open the door. It wasn't locked, because what was there to steal? And stepped inside. The interior was a museum of decay. A table with 2 legs. A rusted iron stove. A narrow bed frame with no mattress. Mouse droppings scattered across the floor like dark confetti. The air smelled of mold and rot and 30 years of abandonment. He set his rucksack down carefully and walked to the one intact window. Through the grimy glass, he could see mountains rolling away in endless waves, purple in the fading light. No houses, no roads, no people, just silence, so complete it rang in his ears. That night, wrapped in the emergency blanket from his pack and lying on the bare floor because the bed frame looked like it would collapse if he breathed on it, Arthur stared at the ceiling and watched his breath make clouds in the freezing air. His hip ached where it pressed against the hardwood. His back screamed. Somewhere outside, an owl called, and something smaller screamed in response. For the first time in 5 years, nobody was calling him useless, because there was nobody to hear him at all. The leak started on day 4. Arthur had managed to get the stove working, had cleared the mouse nests, had even patched the broken window with a tarp from the small shed behind the cabin. But the leak was different. Water seeping up through the floorboards near the stove, turning the wood dark and spongy. He checked the roof, found no obvious breach, which meant the problem was underneath. He spent an hour prying up the rotted boards with a rusted crowbar he'd found in the shed, working carefully despite the arthritis screaming in his fingers. Beneath the floor was a crawl space, maybe 2 feet deep, filled with decades of mud and debris. He needed to get down there, see where the water was coming from, probably a broken pipe or a spring that had shifted. If you're watching this and thinking Arthur should just give up, drop a comment right now saying keep going. Because what he finds next will make you believe that the universe protects the ones who refuse to quit. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You'll regret missing tomorrow's chapter. Arthur lowered himself into the crawl space, his phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The smell of earth and decay filled his nose. He crawled forward, feeling the cold mud soak through his pants, until his light caught something that didn't belong, a perfectly circular iron ring, about 6 inches in diameter, set into what looked like concrete. He brushed away the mud with shaking hands. The concrete formed a square, roughly 3 feet by 3 feet, too precise to be natural. He pulled on the ring experimentally, and the entire square shifted upward an inch before his strength gave out and it settled back with a heavy thunk. His heart hammered. He crawled back, got the crowbar, returned. This time when he pried at the ring, the concrete square lifted, revealing steel underneath. A hatch. A modern hatch, with a digital keypad glowing faintly green in the darkness. Arthur sat back on his heels, mud-covered and trembling, staring at the impossible thing he'd just uncovered beneath a cabin that was supposed to be worthless. His mind raced through explanations. A survivalist's bunker, a bootlegger's cache, a wealthy, eccentric safe room. But the keypad was new, maybe 5 years old at most. Someone had maintained this. Someone had planned for it to be found. He thought of Eleanor, of Victoria's strange will, of the challenge that had seemed designed to kill him. And with shaking fingers, he reached into his shirt and pulled out the locket he'd worn since Eleanor's funeral. Inside was her picture, and on the back, scratched in her handwriting, 6 numbers he'd never understood. 052847. Their wedding date. He punched in the code. The keypad beeped once, and the steel hatch hissed like it was releasing pressure it had held for decades. Slowly, Arthur pulled it open, revealing a ladder descending into LED-lit brightness. He took a breath, thought briefly about the sat phone and calling for help, then dismissed it. If he'd learned anything in 75 years, it was that you don't walk away when the door finally opens. Arthur descended into light. The ladder went down 20 feet into a corridor carved from living rock, the walls smooth and reinforced with steel beams. LED strips ran along the ceiling, motion-activated, illuminating as he moved forward. The air was cool but not cold, climate-controlled, humming with the sound of generators somewhere deeper in the complex. The corridor opened into a chamber that stole Arthur's breath. It was a laboratory, but unlike any he'd ever seen. The walls were lined with glass cases, each one containing plants, but not just plants. Living fossils. Specimens he recognized from botanical journals he'd read decades ago. Species declared extinct, growing in perfect suspension behind temperature-controlled glass. A Franklininia alatamaha tree, extinct in the wild since the 1800s. A Cooksonia, one of the first vascular plants to ever exist, somehow preserved and thriving. Each case was labeled with scientific names, dates, and coordinates where the specimens had been collected. But that wasn't all. In the center of the room stood a vault door, circular and massive, like something from a bank. It was already open, swinging on hinges that probably weighed more than Arthur did. Inside, he could see shelves of documentation, leather-bound journals, patent applications, research papers. And beneath the papers, stacked with the casual indifference of someone who had too much, were bars of gold bullion. Arthur stepped inside the vault, his hands trembling. He picked up one of the journals, opened it to a random page. Victoria's husband's handwriting filled the margins, botanical notes, coordinates, dates spanning 40 years. He'd been a plant hunter, Arthur realized. One of the old-school obsessives who'd traveled the world collecting specimens before globalization and climate change had wiped so many species from existence. The patent applications were organized by year. Arthur recognized some of the names: chemical compounds extracted from rare plants, pharmaceutical applications, agricultural innovations. Several were marked, approved, with dates from the 1970s and 80s. Royalty statements were clipped to each one. He did the math in his head and had to sit down on a steel chair that had been tucked in the corner. The patents alone were probably worth tens of millions. The gold, maybe 20 million more. The plant specimens, if authenticated and sold to botanical gardens or research institutions, could fetch prices he couldn't even calculate. And Victoria had left it all to him. Not to Gerald, who'd stolen his business. Not to Diane, who'd treated him like a servant. Not to Marcus, who'd called him useless to his face. To Arthur, the man they'd sent to die in the mountains. He sat in that vault for an hour, maybe more, letting it sink in. The challenge wasn't about survival. It was about character. Victoria had been watching all those years, seeing how her family treated the widower of her beloved niece. She created a test. Could Arthur endure 6 months of isolation? Could he survive when everyone expected him to fail? The family that had betrayed him would never see a single cent, because they'd never even bother to check if he was alive. Arthur emerged from the vault and began to explore the rest of the facility. There was a living quarters section, a bed, a kitchenette, a bathroom with running water fed by an underground spring and heated by the same generators that powered the lights. There was food storage, enough freeze-dried supplies for a year at least. There was a workshop filled with botanical equipment, microscopes, growth chambers, seed storage. Victoria's husband had built a sanctuary, and Victoria had preserved it, waiting for someone worthy to inherit it. Someone who understood that true wealth didn't come from taking, but from nurturing growth. Arthur climbed back up the ladder, sealed the hatch, and covered it carefully with the floorboards. Then he walked outside into the mountain twilight and looked at the cabin with new eyes. It wasn't a death sentence. It was a fortress, and he had 5 months and 3 weeks to make sure the Sterlings never discovered what lay beneath. The first month, Arthur focused on survival. He repaired the cabin properly, using techniques he'd learned 50 years ago when he'd built his first greenhouse by hand. He replaced rotted boards with lumber he milled from fallen trees, using a portable chainsaw he found in the workshop below. He patched the roof with shingles ordered through the sat phone's emergency supply service, technically allowed, as long as he didn't call for rescue. He insulated the walls with moss and clay, the way his grandfather had taught him. But the second month, something shifted. Arthur began to remember who he'd been before the Sterlings had convinced him he was worthless. He started working the land around the cabin, clearing brush, identifying native species, planting a garden for spring. His hands, soft from 5 years of polishing silver, developed calluses again. His back, bent from psychological weight, began to straighten. He used the botanical knowledge from the vault's journals to identify medicinal plants growing wild on the mountain. He created a small nursery in a sheltered corner of the property, carefully transplanting specimens, testing soil compositions. Every morning he woke before dawn and worked until dark, not because anyone was watching, but because the work itself was medicine. The physical transformation was remarkable. The weight he'd carried in his gut from stress and depression began to melt away, replaced by lean muscle from splitting wood and hauling stone. His face, which had developed the gray pallor of someone who'd given up, darkened with sun and wind until he looked like the outdoorsman he'd been in his youth. His eyes, which had held defeat, now carried something sharper. He established a routine. Mornings above ground, working the land. Afternoons in the vault, studying the botanical research, understanding the scope of what he'd inherited. Evenings by the fire, eating simple meals, reading the journals by lamplight. The sat phone sat in the corner, and used except for supply orders. He had no desire to speak to anyone from his old life. By month 3, Arthur had created something beautiful. The cabin, once a rotting shell, now stood solid and weatherproof. The land around it had been transformed into a working homestead, vegetable garden, herb spiral, a small orchard of grafted fruit trees that would bear fruit in years to come. He'd even repaired the old well, giving him fresh water without relying on the vault systems. He was stronger at 75 than he'd been at 70, and he was angrier. Not the hot anger of youth, but the cold, patient anger of someone who'd been systematically broken down and had chosen to rebuild himself. The Sterlings thought they'd sent him to die. Instead, they'd given him exactly what he needed: time, isolation, and a reason to remember his own worth. Gerald had hired someone cheap. Arthur spotted him on day 93, a man in his 40s wearing camouflage that was too new and boots that hadn't been broken in. He was sweating despite the November cold, holding a camera with a telephoto lens, hiding behind a pine tree about 200 yards from the cabin. Arthur pretended not to notice. He went about his routine, splitting wood, tending the garden, carrying supplies into the cabin. But he made sure to look frail, to move slowly, to cultivate the image of a man barely surviving. The investigator took photos for 2 hours, then hiked back down the mountain, satisfied that Arthur was exactly what the Sterlings expected: a broken old man counting down the days until he could escape his exile. What the investigator didn't see was Arthur descending into the vault that evening, or the satisfied smile on his face as he checked the security cameras he'd installed around the property. What he didn't see was Arthur cataloging the plant specimens, preparing documentation for authentication, contacting lawyers through encrypted email using the vault's satellite internet connection. But the investigator did see the cabin, and he saw that it was larger than expected, more solid. And when he reported back to Gerald, curiosity must have gotten the better of someone, because 2 weeks later, Arthur's security cameras picked up something that made his blood run cold. Someone had broken into the vault's external ventilation system, the one vent that emerged a quarter-mile from the cabin, disguised as a natural rock formation. They'd sent down a fiber optic camera, and they'd seen the lights, the steel walls, the suggestion of something vast and hidden. The investigators' report must have included enough detail to make the Sterlings suspicious. And now they knew Arthur wasn't just surviving. He was living in a place that had secrets. Secrets worth investigating. Secrets worth stealing. Arthur had 2 weeks before the challenge period ended. 2 weeks before the cabin and everything beneath it became legally his. 2 weeks to make sure the Sterlings never got close enough to take what they'd already lost. They came in the dark, 3 vehicles grinding up a service road Arthur hadn't even known existed, headlights cutting through the December night. Arthur watched them on the security monitors in the vault, Gerald's Mercedes SUV leading, followed by 2 trucks carrying what looked like construction equipment. They parked half a mile from the cabin and approached on foot, trying for stealth, but moving with the graceless noise of people who'd never spent real time in the wild. Gerald, Diane, Marcus, and 4 men Arthur didn't recognize. Hired muscle, probably. They carried flashlights, crowbars, and what looked like containers of accelerant. The plan was obvious: burn the cabin, claim Arthur had died in an accident, seize the property before the challenge period expired. Arthur had prepared for this. The mountain had taught him patience, and the vault had taught him leverage. He'd spent the last 2 weeks setting up defenses that would have made his grandfather proud, a combination of old-school wilderness traps and modern technology that turned the homestead into something the Sterlings were catastrophically unprepared for. The first man triggered the tripwire 50 yards from the cabin. A net woven from paracord dropped from the trees, tangling him completely. His shout alerted the others, who approached more carefully, which meant they walked directly into the second defense. Motion-activated lights that Arthur had positioned to create blinding intersections of glare. Suddenly the forest was bright as day, and the Sterlings were exposed, stumbling and swearing. "Arthur!" Gerald's voice rang out, trying for friendly and landing somewhere near desperate. "Arthur, we're here to help. The lawyer said you might need assistance before the deadline." Arthur stepped out onto the porch, backlit by the cabin's interior lights, holding his grandfather's Winchester rifle. He didn't point it at anyone, didn't need to. The message was clear. The challenge ends in 6 days. Arthur said, his voice carrying across the clearing with a strength that made Gerald step backward. "You're trespassing on private property." Diane tried next, her voice saccharine. "Arthur, please. We were worried about you. We brought supplies, we thought." "You thought I'd be dead by now," Arthur interrupted. "You thought you could claim this land, and whatever you suspected was beneath it. But you were wrong about me. You've always been wrong about me." Marcus started forward, one of the hired men beside him. "Old man, you don't know what you're." The motion sensor triggered the sprinkler system Arthur had rigged throughout the clearing. But instead of water, it sprayed a mixture of deer urine and liquid fertilizer he'd concocted in the vault's laboratory. The smell was instantaneous and overwhelming, a stench so profound that Marcus dropped to his knees and vomited. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Arthur said calmly. "Thieves, liars, people who spent 5 years convincing me I was worthless so you could take everything I'd built. But you made one mistake. You left me alone long enough to remember who I was before you broke me down." Gerald was backing toward the vehicles now, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the police. You're holding us hostage, you're—" "No signal," Arthur said. "Hasn't been signal on this mountain for 30 years. That's why Victoria's husband built what he built down there. That's why she left it to someone who'd appreciate isolation." He smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. "You have 2 choices. Walk back to your vehicles and drive away. Or stay and find out what else I've learned about defending what's mine." One of the hired men raised a crowbar. "There's 6 of us and 1 of him." Arthur fired the Winchester into the air. The crack echoed off the mountains, and somewhere in the distance, a rock slide answered. The hired men were already running. Marcus stumbled after them, still gagging. Diane held Gerald's arm, her expensive boots sliding in the mud as she pulled him backward. "This isn't over," Gerald sputtered. "We'll sue. We'll contest the will. You'll lose," Arthur said quietly. "Because I've already contacted Victoria's lawyers. Because I've already documented everything you stole from me. The business, the house, the money you convinced me to loan your children. Because I have 5 years of evidence and 6 days until this property is legally mine, and when that happens, I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you did." They ran. All of them. Arthur stood on the porch and watched their headlights disappear down the mountain, and then he went inside, sealed the cabin, and descended into the vault where the Real work waited. The courtroom was smaller than Arthur had expected, wood-paneled and quiet, smelling of old books and furniture polish. The Sterlings sat on one side with their lawyer, an expensive man in a suit that probably cost more than Arthur's monthly Social Security check used to be. Arthur sat alone on the other side, though Patricia Hendricks, Victoria's lawyer, was technically representing the estate. Gerald contested the will on grounds of undue influence and mental incapacity. He argued that Victoria hadn't been in her right mind, that the challenge was cruel and unusual, that Arthur had manipulated a dying woman. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Harmon, listened with a face that gave nothing away. Then Patricia stood and presented the evidence. Victoria's medical records showing perfect cognitive function up until her death. Video testimony recorded months before she passed, explaining in detail why she'd structured the will exactly as she had. "I watched my family treat Arthur Penhaligon like a servant in his own home." Victoria's voice rang out in the courtroom. "I watched them steal his business, his dignity, his sense of self-worth." This challenge wasn't cruelty. It was liberation. But the real blow came when Patricia submitted Arthur's documentation. Contracts Gerald had falsified to take the landscaping business. Bank records showing the systematic draining of Arthur's retirement accounts. Testimony from former employees about how Gerald had forced Arthur out of the company he'd built. 5 years of systematic elder abuse, laid out in devastating detail. Judge Harmon didn't take long to decide. The will stood. Arthur received the cabin and all its contents. And as a bonus, she granted a restraining order preventing any member of the Sterling family from coming within 500 yards of Arthur or the property. Gerald's face went purple. Diane stared at the table. Marcus had the decency to look ashamed. But Arthur wasn't finished. 6 months after taking legal possession, he contacted the Smithsonian the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, and 3 major pharmaceutical companies. The plant specimens were authenticated as genuine extinct species, preserved in viable condition through Victoria's husband's obsessive care. The patents were verified and updated. The gold was real. The final valuation came in at $127 million. Arthur kept the cabin and 5 acres around it as his personal residence. The rest of the property, nearly 200 acres of mountain wilderness, became the Penhaligon Conservatory, a protected botanical research station open to universities and dedicated to preserving endangered plant species. He endowed it with enough money to run for 100 years. He used another portion of the fortune to establish a legal defense fund for seniors facing elder abuse, offering free representation to anyone being exploited by their families. The Gerald Sterling case, as it became known in legal circles, became the template for prosecuting financial abuse of the elderly. And he kept the vault exactly as he'd found it, adding only one thing, a plaque that read, "True wealth grows from the ground up. It cannot be stolen, only cultivated." The Sterlings sold their estate to pay legal fees and settlements. Gerald's business failed within 2 years. Diane moved across the country. Marcus sent one letter, apologizing, which Arthur read and then burned. On the 5-year anniversary of taking possession, Arthur stood on the cabin's porch, now expanded into a wraparound with a view of the mountains, and watched researchers from 3 continents work in the conservatory's greenhouses. The extinct plants were thriving. Seeds were being distributed to botanical gardens worldwide. Knowledge that had been hidden was now saving species from the brink. He thought about Eleanor, about how she'd have loved to see this. He thought about Victoria, who'd understood that the best revenge wasn't cruelty, it was proving someone's worth to themselves. And he thought about the silver polish in the Sterling mansion, gathering dust now that there was no one left to polish it. Arthur smiled and went inside to check on his seedlings. He had work to do, and finally, after 75 years, it was work that mattered.